Hello and welcome to the Problem Gambling Podcast. I'm Barry Grant, an addiction counselor with Extern Problem Gambling. And my co-host is Claire Donegan, who also works with the project. She's a lived experience expert and recovery coach and leads out the Empower Her Recovery Network, women's service within the Extern Problem Gambling service. And our guest today, all the way from Philadelphia, who have just won the Super Bowl last night. I don't know when this is going out, so this could be a weird anachronism whenever this goes out into the world. But we recorded it the day after the Super Bowl, and all the way from Philadelphia, we have Rob Minnick. Many of you will know him online from his various social media platforms. He has been Rob O'Dat. That is one day at a time for those of you who aren't in the know. And his platforms are now ODAT Gambling Awareness. Do I have that right? And
You
that
got it.
includes the website and there's the podcast and there's stuff before I was looking at all your stuff again that I've been following you on Instagram for a long time, but I'm just kind of looking at all the different platforms today. Tons and tons and tons of great advice and great content on there from Rob. So please do check all those out and we'll be giving out all that information again at the end in case you didn't get it right now. So Rob Minnick, thanks for joining us today. Do you want to start off, as we always kind of ask everybody, just tell us about your experience of how your issues with gambling developed? Where did it all start off?
Yeah, 100%. And thank you for the introduction. Usually I have to fight for my life to get my the name of my podcast mentioned when I go and do something like this. So you mentioned it a bunch of times. I really appreciate that. Thank you for having me. And yeah, we can dive right into it. So as mentioned, I'm living in Philadelphia. Right now I'm 25 years old, about to be 26. But back when I was 18 years old, still living in this general area, maybe about 20 minutes to the east in New Jersey, with my family. Growing up, we always watched sports. And for us, that meant American football, it meant hockey, it meant baseball, it meant basketball, but it was all the Philadelphia teams. And whether we would have our family events during the week or a weekend, say we were having someone's birthday party or we were meeting up for like a family event with my mom's half of the family and my dad's half of the family, or both, it was always happening centered around a game. So it would be the Sixers game. The basketball team would play during the week. We would start hanging out at 7 p.m. because that's when the game would tip off. If it was a family weekend event, it would usually start around 1 o'clock on a Sunday because that's when the Eagles game would kick off for that week. And so when I was 18 years old, my friends and I found daily fantasy sports, which is essentially a fantasy football season packaged into one night or even possibly one game in the NFL. And what happens is you're given a select budget within that platform. Each player has a certain amount of the budget that they require for you to draft them to your team. And then you compete against everyone else that put a team in to win cash prizes. And somehow, believe it or not, that is still to this day not considered gambling in the United States by law. That is considered sweepstakes or a skill game. But we won't dive too far into that, I'm sure. We'll keep going through the recovery process. But right away, when we were playing those games, we wanted to have a stake in the games that we were already watching. We wanted to feel like we were getting more skin in the game, more experience from watching those Eagles games. And then when we would win, we would think, wow, like we just won maybe $100 here or there. But as an 18-year-old whose only job at this time was working at an ice cream store for $8.38 an hour, winning $100 was a life-changing thing. That was 3 days worth of work because it was part-time as well. And it was just like this incredible rush that I got from coming across these wins because at the time they felt monumental to me. And then at 10 o'clock every night, my friends would be happy with whatever happened in our contest. They either won or lost, but they had a good time and they'd go to sleep. Because when we would go back to high school, in the mornings, we would go to school at like 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. It was incredibly early for me, at least. But I would stay up until 2, 3 in the morning playing the West Coast contests and then out towards eventually when I began betting on sports, Hawaii and games over there. So I don't know what that time zone would be over in Ireland, but you'd probably be 18 hours behind that. I don't even know. It's an incredible time difference, but that's what I was doing. I was staying up all night gambling on these games or putting contests in on these games, thinking that I was getting better at it, that it was the more I played, the more successful I would be. As I acquired more knowledge about sports, I would somehow use that knowledge to make more money. And that very quickly led me after that to begin sports betting. And this was now not just a fantasy sports contest, this was betting on the money line of the game, the over under, the spreads of games, regular sports bets. And I did that for the most part in like a legal gray area, which was using a website called Bovada, which I believe is licensed in Latvia, but it can operate in some US states that don't have regulated gambling. Not that that's any better, but that is what we have at the moment. And then I was also using a bookie on the side to access extra credit that I didn't actually have in cash. Um, and do let me know if you hear an ambulance at any time. I can just pause because I hear one, but I don't know if the microphone's picking it up.
Yeah, we're picking it up, but it adds to the ambience, you know.
I was
As long as there's nobody connected to you that needs the ambulance, in which case, of course, you should
fair
pause
enough.
immediately.
Yeah, it happens. It'll happen again, I'm sure. Let's see. Okay. So at this point, I was beginning to sports bet. I had a bookie, and this was right when I started to go to university. So I went from New Jersey and I moved to Washington, D.C., where I went to school. And basically, right away, the gambling increased because now I was isolated. I had made a couple friends while I was there, and especially early on, but we talked about sports still. It felt like I had gone from one friend group that talked about sports that were all Philadelphia fans to another friend group from all over the country that was doing the same thing, just supporting different teams. But again, I found myself to be taking things to a more extreme level than everyone that I was around, which led to me isolating when I would get to bigger bet sizes, or if we were all watching a game together, I wouldn't be honest about how much I was gambling on the game. And that played itself out for the first year of university. And right at the end, or just about at the end of my second semester, I went into debt from gambling for the very first time. So I'm sure that everyone around the world probably has heard of this tournament. It's the March Madness tournament in men's college basketball in the United States. And within that tournament, essentially, I believe it's 128 teams in the earlier rounds. I don't want to butcher it though. Within that tournament, there's a lot of teams from around the country that get matched up with each other, and they compete basically throughout the entirety of March in basketball games. And it's a tournament single elimination bracket. And within that, there's 16 seeds in each category. The one seed plays the 16 seed, as is customary in any sporting event, I believe, but never in tournament history at this point, this is back in 2018, never in tournament history had a 16 seed defeated a one seed in the college basketball tournament in the men's bracket. Um, Knowing that, I obviously didn't gamble on that game because at this point, I was gambling a lot, but I was still within a realm of control to the point where I hadn't gone into debt yet as a result of my gambling. But seeing that 16 seed that year, UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, beat Virginia uh, for the first time in tournament history, it gave me this like strange anger. And I like to say now that looking back, I think the one thing that would bother me more than losing a bet when I was gambling was not making a bet that I would have won because I would always tell myself it was obvious. And I actually found a way to convince myself at this time, I don't know how I did this, that I should have known that the 16 seed was going to beat the one seed. Like the most absurd thing that ever happened in that tournament, I convinced myself that it should have been obvious. And so following that, they played the nine seed, Kansas State, UMBC versus Kansas State 2018 March Madness. They lost because it turned out they weren't a very good basketball team. They just had a very good game plan, supposedly, for that first game. But during that second game, out of almost spite or anger, I took all the money that I had access to with that bookie, which was a credit line I could not pay back, and I put it on to UMBC to win the game. And that was the very first time that like alarm bells started going off. I got more credit from the bookie because I think that throughout the time that I was gambling, one thing that was always common was I was decently resourceful and decently persuasive. I convinced him that I had the money to pay him back because I had won some previous bets. So he knew I had that money. I didn't, but I told him I did. And then I was like, listen, like there's this other game coming up. There's so many bets here. Give me a little bit more credit. He did. I kept going up and down, but then the this is terrible too, looking back. The thing that sent me into realized debt for the first time as a result of gambling was a baseball game, but they were playing an exhibition. I think it was the Yankees, and I want to say it was the Nationals they were playing, but I zoned out after my bet lost early on in the game. I'd taken the under because I'm like, oh well, these guys probably stink. They don't play very often. It was like the minor league team essentially playing. And then they scored like 11 runs in the first 2 innings. And I was like, oh, well, that's it. And that was the first time I had to tell my parents that I went into debt as a result of my gambling. Um, yeah, I don't want to ramble too long. Do you want to pose questions throughout, or do you want me to just go front to back?
Well, I can jump in with a couple of questions or observations there, if that's okay. Apologies if there's a lot of background noise here because there are people doing groundwork outside. But so, yeah, I mean, you mentioned university, and that's something that comes up a lot in our counseling service that people kind of move away from home for the first time, who might have more free time on their hands. I mean, some of the Irish university courses might just be 12 hours of lectures a week,
Mm,
and they've
mm,
gone from kind of insane levels of cramming and 40-hour school days at high school or our equivalent of
mm.
high school into this thing where you've got a lot of free time, you're living away from home, kind of money, yeah, or you're kind of responsible for your own finances maybe for the first time. So the university thing is a big trigger for a lot of people, I think. And then when you mentioned credit, I mean, because Ireland has had legalized sports betting basically since the inception of the state, nearly 100 years since we had our first law permitting sports betting. And you told us say you're going to be visiting Ireland, so in the not too distant future, every town and village and city that you go to will have what we call bookies shops or betting shops on the high street of the smallest village of the biggest town. They're everywhere, and they have been for 100 years. So we come from the perspective, and the same in the UK, in England, Scotland, Wales. It's very similar. Uh, so my kind of understanding, and we've had a lot of American guests on over the years, and I've done some training with the Pennsylvania Council on Problem
Mm.
Gambling, your neck of the woods
Yeah.
as well. That my understanding is like kind of watching The Sopranos, and we're kind of going, there's these gangster guys, and they're really dangerous. And they'll take your bets, and they'll give you a line of credit, but if you mess up, there's going to be some serious consequences. So when you say getting a line of credit with a bookie, because look,
Mm.
vast majority of the people who use our services get into debt, and it's usually with the credit card company or with the bank.
Yeah.
Rarely, occasionally, it might be a loan shark, so somebody who's actually going to be a physical danger to them, right? That's rare, but generally, it's the banks, it's the credit card companies. So, just so our listeners over this side of the pond understand what you're talking about in terms of a bookie like that and giving you lines of credit, would that be a person who might do you harm if you were not going to pay them promptly, or
I think that's the exact picture that my parents had in mind of what my bookie looked like, which led to them like then reaching out and like fronting me money to pay him back. That was not at all what he looked like. In fact, he couldn't have been less intimidating. I think the bookies of today are serving a much different function than the bookies maybe 2 decades ago. Because 2 decades ago there was no legalized gambling at all outside of Atlantic City and Las Vegas. And it was only in 2018 that we started to allow states to legalize online sports betting. Um, but, no, I think the bookies have shifted from that backroom Tony Soprano, like break your leg in a deli, to like a frat guy. And the reason is because the bookies now are fielding bets that you otherwise might not have been able to place. But anyone who's 21 is well aware right now that you can gamble legally. Incredibly highly advertised. So the bookies now are like kids maybe that have access to someone's account that they can place bets on. That's maybe like their dad or their brother. Or if they're taking the traditional system of like a bookie that's extending lines of credit, we're talking like decently small lines of credit at this point. It's not like if you've maybe seen Uncut Gems where Adam Sandler has a bookie that's fronting him like $2 million bets. These are like kids going for their marketing degree in university. It's just a much different feeling. But that exact like idea of what that is, of what a bookie is actually led to me getting bailed out for the first time. Because had I gone and tried to pay him back myself, what would have happened is because side note, I feel like I was always decently honest in paying people back. I lied about the reasons that I needed money. I lied about what I was doing with that money, but I made sure to always pay people back once I had it. That was like a big thing that I never broke. That if I had broke, I would have been really disappointed. But what would have happened is I would have gone on like a payment plan, $100 a week for however many weeks it would have taken. It would have been like that. It wouldn't have been like a machete or anything like that coming after me. But you know, diving back into the timeline now, at this point, I go home for the summer after my first year of college, and I worked two jobs. I was working at a an Applebee's. I remember I did not like that very much, but I was also I guess it was three jobs, driving food for a Chinese restaurant and a pizza restaurant. So I went from betting these large sums of money to working jobs to pay it off, jobs that I didn't like, jobs that were exhausting, jobs that didn't pay very much money. Um, and you would think logically that having to work so hard for smaller sums of money, I would redevelop an appreciation for the dollar. But essentially, as soon as I hit like minimum weekly payments to my parents, the rest of the money went back into gambling again to try to get it all paid off in one lump sum win. So really, the bailout, not that I'm faulting them for trying to do their best, but the bailout enabled me to continue gambling without the pressure because now I was paying back my parents instead of paying back someone who might have applied more pressure, though again, not backroom pressure in the deli. Um, but yeah, it's like that should have logically been the moment where I was like, okay, like that didn't work out, let's move on. But instead, I took it, I was almost like, okay, you made a mistake, you made a bad bet, you got unlucky. And that's the pattern that would keep repeating for years. Um, Whenever I retell the story, it was just an uneventful second year of college, honestly. I think things really picked up for me in the third year. We call it junior year. But during that second year, it was again ups and downs, small debts, having them pay back off. It was with a bookie. It was back online again with like sites like Bovada. But things really got bad when I made this decision. So as maybe people who are listening that are in recovery or seeking recovery from gambling can relate to, there's certain periods of time where you're just feeling hopeless. Like you have spent everything, you don't know what to do, you're at like a really low point before you regain that motivation to go and try again and end up in the same position later on. But during one of those low points, like I never thought to myself that it was the gambling that was the problem. I tried different things to blame in my head. Oh, you're taking the wrong courses. That's why you're feeling meaningless because the coursework sucks. Oh, you had a fight with your girlfriend. That's why it's the problem. It's her fault. And it would be things like this. And then I had this thought and I was like, huh, maybe it's the school that I'm at. I should go for a semester abroad. And I was like, okay, where should I go? And I looked at all the things and they all required a language, a second language to be spoken, which I don't speak. And then I see one and it's Sydney, Australia. And I decided to go there without knowing anything about it, in fairness. But I would come to find out that Australia has, I believe, the highest gambling losses per capita in the world. And as you described earlier about how on every high street in Ireland there's a casino or a bookie shop, I saw that very much in Sydney. And no matter where you went, you basically had access to gambling. And in the beginning, it felt like I had walked into heaven because no matter where I went, I could gamble. And in fact, I flew from New York City to Sydney. It took about 18 hours with a layover. And instead of going to sleep or instead of going to explore, I put my bags down at the student accommodations and I went straight to the Star Casino and I started playing poker there. And I think I sat there for like 6 or 7 hours before I went back to school. And that's how I spent like every day for the next three, 3.5 months. And then they ended up sending us back early because of COVID, because of the pandemic. But I spent just my entire study abroad, studying the inside of the casino, I suppose. And that was the first time ever that someone had actually said something to me, like, I think you have a gambling problem. And it was one of the craps dealers, because I had seen him 6 or 7 days in a row, and I was significantly younger than most of the other people in there in the middle of the day. Um, and he was like, we were making conversation throughout the week, but like the sixth or seventh day, he was like, you really shouldn't be here. And I was like, you shouldn't be here. Like, I didn't know how to respond. I was like, no, you're wrong. But he tried in like a friendly way. He didn't, continue much after that. But it was like the first time that I guess it had become apparent that I was gambling crazy amounts. I was gambling long days consistently, like a very high frequency. And then when I would leave the casino and walk back home, I'd stop at a pub, which had the slots, the pokies, and then they had what's called a TAB, which I guess is like the equivalent of like um, a William Hill machine. Is that what it would be there? Yeah. So they
Yeah,
had the
TAB is sports betting
yeah,
conglomerate over there.
yeah. It was huge. But it's in every pub, and it's like a vending machine for sports bets. Uh, but yeah, so the American sports would start at like 9, 10 in the morning, sometimes like a little earlier. So people would wake up and go and drink at the bars and watch the games, and that's at like 8 in the morning on like before we go to school. It was just a really unhealthy lifestyle. But yeah, I want to give another spot to pause. Do you want to follow up there at all? Should I come back in the story to the US?
Yeah, no, that's a good opportunity just to jump in. Yeah, I mean, Ireland, as many Irish Americans know, Ireland kind of part of the reason why Ireland gets to survive and thrive is because it sends lots of its young people out into other parts of the world. It's kind of like one Irish politician described it as our safety valve. It's an emigration to the US, Canada, Australia, most of the English speaking world and elsewhere. So huge amounts of Irish people that go out to Australia, sometimes just for a gap year, sometimes they stay out there for much longer. But I've worked with many Irish people who come back from Australia, and they've developed many of them have developed severe gambling problems out there because in Ireland you cannot have a gambling product or gambling service in a venue that sells alcohol. Right? So that's while we do have legalized gambling, you cannot have gambling and alcohol in the same venue. So we don't have like Atlantic City or Vegas where there's casinos with booze and 24 hour and all this sort of stuff. We have small casinos but no alcohol except for some rare exceptions, which are kind of private clubs. But Australia is kind of the worst of all worlds. So we're like,
Yeah.
we'll take sports betting, we'll take slot machines, we'll stick them in a pub, we'll have big casinos, all the alcohol, all the stuff. So dangerous place for anybody who might have an interest in gambling or might be starting to develop an interest in gambling or a gambling problem to go to. Claire, do you have any thoughts? I'm conscious I'm doing all the talking here.
Yeah, well, like my bet that got me kind of on the road to gambling, I suppose, was the night before I flew to Australia. I had this winning bet, just kind of a random thing. Then I flew to Australia. I was only there for a month. I was visiting family. But I was shocked at the just I don't know, abundance, I suppose, of opportunities to gamble in Australia. I thought it was a bit crap, to be honest, because at the time I liked kind of horse racing and you don't get your stake back over there, so it's actually kind of shit. but but what I did find strange was the pokies. The pokies are crazy. Like they have these rugby league clubs over there and they're big venues, but half of them are taken up with these machines and there's people on them all day. Now, I personally never got into it, but it was like I can see obviously why they have a big issue over there. I think you have to be there to see how crazy this is.
Yeah.
But I think what you've done, like in everything you've said so far, Rob, is really highlight the how much you can justify your actions and behaviors to yourself because logically you think back and you go, well, that was a bit mad. But at the time you thought, I should have known that. Of course I should have known that because it justified something in you because you had evidence that somewhere along the line you'd had this bet and it had won and you could have replicated that because you should have known which we
Yep.
know now is mental. But I can say that because I've been there. I just think it's very difficult. I've people say reaching out and they tell me that their family members, they just can't understand what's going on in their heads. And that's why they want to talk to people like you and me. And I get that, because honestly, it's so hard to explain to people that what is going on in your brain at the time, that you can actually justify those thoughts.
Yeah, you're desperately seeking a solution to the problem you're creating, and it's anything else except stopping the problem. It's like anything else will do in your head, I guess. You brought up a lot of good points there. Um, Barry brought up one thing I wanted to touch on as well, was how in Ireland, since there's a separation between the alcohol and the gambling, that likely leads to a positive outcome in that sense, that like they're not fueling one another in the venue, at least. In Australia, I was in Sydney, and during this time they had like a really bad problem, which was very strange to me. But they had this problem where people were getting killed because they were getting very drunk and then getting into fights, and the fights were leading to deaths. It was called the one punch laws in Sydney. And so the response by the New South Wales government was, let's close bars at a certain time so that they can't get alcohol after, I believe it was 1 or 2 in the morning. Um, but the problem was that at 1 or 2 in the morning, when all the bars would close and all the clubs would close, there was one venue that had an exception from the lawmakers to continue to serve alcohol, and it was the Star Casino in Sydney. And so you would see this mass migration of the drunkest people in Sydney going to the casino to keep drinking because it was the only place that was still open, which I imagine those were their highest grossing hours for profits. It was a law that led, I think that law let down the people of New South Wales. It definitely let me down. So I hope that there wasn't too much damage done from it, but yeah. And as you said, Claire, it's just like I was seeking an answer to what I was doing, and I just wasn't yet ready to take accountability for my own actions. And it's very hard to explain that, which is why I'm happy to be on a podcast where hopefully the audience has a little bit of background context about problem gambling. Because if they don't, I probably sound nuts. And like, that's just how it is. It sounds nuts until you understand it for yourself.
Yeah, and I think most people tuning into a podcast called the Problem Gambling Podcast are probably here for a reason, and they didn't stumble across it when one would hope. But I know a lot of family members and even kind of healthcare professionals would listen to it to get a better understanding, even if they themselves have never experienced a problem with gambling. But I'm just conscious of the time, and I hate kind of cutting you short, having to kind of rush you, but I know you need to get to another meeting after this. But because I'd like to hear a little bit about your recovery story as well.
Yeah.
So, in terms of, okay, you went back to the States from Australia, obviously. When do you feel you hit your kind of rock bottom moment,
Yeah.
or when was that for you?
Pretty soon after. So, following Australia, I came back to the United States and I had just turned 21 years old while I was in Australia. So, once I came back, it was lockdown, but also I was able to gamble legally now on sites that were operators like FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, Caesars. So, I was going around claiming all the promotions that I could, fueling my gambling. And it wasn't a lot of sports betting at this time. At this time, it was poker and it was casino games because the sports weren't happening. But Korean baseball was the first to reopen, and I started gambling on that in the middle of the night as soon as I had like access to it. So over the next 2 years, I'd find myself going through patterns of having wins, chasing bigger wins, experiencing losses, finding myself in debt, paying it off, and running back through that same cycle. There was a ton of online gambling, there was a ton of casino gambling, but the majority of it was online sports betting. By the time that I was reaching what I would deem a bottom, I was actually spinning slots quite often. And I would set up the slots on my phone, hit 100 auto spins on whatever it was that I was staking, and then I'd put it in my pocket and go about my day. Like maybe I was at the gym or I was walking around, and I'd be listening to the sounds coming in through my headphones. And just based on the sound that it would make, I knew how much money I had won or lost on any given bet. Just the sound. They had different pitches for different ranges of payout. So that's basically the highest compulsion that I was at. I was able to know that just blindly. There's tons of stories littered throughout there of times where I experienced wins that turned into big losses or losses that fueled me into anger, desperation, paying off debts, lying. But I can remember hitting a bottom very specifically after I had a win. And I used the money from the win to travel to Paris. And one of the things I had always told myself was I was gambling to live a life of freedom. I was gambling so that I could get that big win, set myself up, and be able to do whatever I wanted whenever I wanted. And I did. That's exactly what I did. And I landed there doing whatever I wanted. And within 2 hours, I was spinning slots on the toilet in the hotel. And that's the first time that I asked myself the question of like, why are you doing this? Because I had asked, why did you make that bet? Why did you make that mistake? You should have known. But it was always that gambling was a given and the method was the problem. I finally asked myself, like, what was the point of any of this if you're not even able to recognize why you're doing it? And I came back and I started going to Gamblers Anonymous, but I wish I could tell you that's what got me to stop gambling. It's not. It was a mixture of things that would happen 8 months later. So November the 12th of 2022, I had recently moved from New Jersey to Philadelphia so that's crossing state lines. And in the United States, of course, every state has its own laws and its own self-exclusion policy when it comes to gambling. So I had self-excluded in New Jersey as the people in Gamblers Anonymous got me to do or told me I should do. But I had moved and I realized like, hey, I can gamble here if I wanted to. I was feeling bored. I was feeling like I was behind. I was feeling like I didn't really know what gave me meaning anymore. And basically, just to sum it all, basically to sum that up, felt sorry for myself. That day, I would place a sports bet in the morning, and then I would gamble for 12 hours following that. I would take out cash advances to the point that I'd spend the next 6 months working 80 hours a week to pay off what I created in one day in terms of debt. So I basically had 8 months of sobriety, big gambling day, and then from that point, 6 months to pay off that debt. And what got me to finally stop gambling was a second thought that was pretty ridiculous. So during that day, I was drinking, I was walking around, and I was carrying the cash in the casino. And because it was cash advances, it was like $100 bills that I had. It was the most money I had ever had in my hand. And it was a wad of $100 bills like this. I had it in my pocket without a money clip, without a rubber band. And later in the evening, maybe about 8 hours into the gambling session, I went to like pull my phone out of my pocket and I dropped like probably about $1,000. And I picked it up and I was like, oh my God, I wonder if I dropped any money anywhere else. And then I like paused for a second and I started laughing, like incredibly loud. People must have thought I was nuts in the bathroom. But the reason that I was laughing was because I had this thought. If I dropped that money somewhere else, someone will pick it up and they'll have a great day. They'll be incredibly happy that they picked up that money. If I did not drop any money, it didn't matter because I was going to go out there and lose it anyway at the casino. And that's exactly what I did with the remainder of the money. I went home, and that paired with what I do now for my work, I guess you could call it, has gotten me to about 2.5 years worth of sobriety from gambling. So November the 12th of 2022 was my last bet. And it was many bets, but having that thought of like, why, like, are you doing this? It doesn't even matter if you win. That helped to push me over the edge into really solidifying my plan of recovery. And so there's four things that I essentially focused on. I'll start with, well, I guess it doesn't matter what order. I told my parents what was going on again, and my mom started managing my bank account as a 23, 24-year-old at the time, which was horrible and embarrassing, and I felt terrible about it, but it stopped me from gambling when I would get temptations over the next couple months because I was only carrying around cash and I was an online gambler for the most part. So that didn't really tempt me to have a little bit of cash for bills and for food and spending. Second was self-excluding in my state, so self-excluding in Pennsylvania to make sure it was as difficult to access gambling as possible. Third was going to the support group meetings more consistently, so making sure I got to my meeting every single week. And then the fourth thing I think is what's really helped it to stick for me. And as you see, my name's ODAT Gambling Awareness here in the tag. The reason is because every day now, for about 7 to 9 hours, sometimes a little more, I'll be creating content and meeting with people and having conversations like this. And all of it is centered around helping someone else avoid going down the same path that I did with their gambling. It kind of stemmed from at a meeting that I went to shortly after my relapse. The next youngest person in my meeting stopped showing up, and it was quite evident that he stopped showing up. It's a very small meeting. And I gave him a call and I said, "Hey, like, what's going on? Where you at?" He said he had gone back to gambling because of XYZ things in his life. And I told him, "Hey, I don't know what the answer to all of this is, but I can tell you that it's not that. Because listen, that just happened to me a couple weeks ago, and you don't want to put yourself in the same situation that I'm in right now." And I guess a mixture of what I said and a mixture of what he had already previously thought got him to come back into the meeting the next week. And that made me feel like really good. So I said, okay, I can do that. That's what I can do to give myself meaning. I can record myself saying basically what I said to him, put it on YouTube. Millions of people will watch it, and I'll be famous and help people. And then I put it up, and no one watched the video, like almost zero views for the first couple months. And my girlfriend said to me, she's like, "Hey, I saw your video. It sucked." And I was like, "Oh, thanks. Like, love you too." But she said, "No, no, no. It was good content, good idea. You just need to make it more exciting. People don't want to be lectured." And I said, "Okay, what do I do?" She said, "Put it on TikTok." I was like, "TikTok? The app for like kids who do their dances and stuff?" I'm like, "No, I'm good." But she said, "Just try it." And I did. And I recorded myself in the drive-through of a Dunkin' Donuts talking about how roulette's not a 50-50 game. And basically hit post, put the phone away. And then the next day I go back and it's at like 1.3 million views. And I was like, oh my God, this might be the app. And from that moment, for like 2 years straight, I posted like 5 to 6 videos a day on TikTok. So it ended up turning into the purpose and the thing that I filled my time with, which was the missing piece for me in my recovery. And that's how we got here today.
That's amazing. Yeah, because the social media thing, like in the beginning when I started with the project about 9 years ago, of course, you're kind of promoting, and trying to get it out on all the different social media channels and doing all this stuff. And originally, when we started the podcast, however many years ago, I was doing all that stuff and cutting up clips and da, 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 da. And then in recent years, my enthusiasm for social media has fallen off a cliff. And I
I
try and
get
stay
it.
away from it as much as humanly possible, apart from the obligatory stuff that I have to do for work. But like I know from talking to so many clients in counseling sessions that so many of them get their information, not just about gambling, but lots of different things, mental health issues, whatever, it's kind of well-being, they get it from TikTok, they get it from Instagram, they get it from all these places that I tend to avoid like the plague. So it's great that you and others are out there putting that great information out there. And that's amazing, like that you could go from, because I mean, if that's a brand new TikTok account and you haven't posted before, let's go from nothing to 1.3 million views is amazing. Like that is not an easy thing to do.
But it goes to show that anyone could do it. I mean, I had a $0 budget. I was living in my mom's basement because I was in debt from gambling addiction. And then I was still able to reach an audience. Like anyone can get their phone, say something that matters to them, and people will see it. It's a beautiful thing.
Oh my
Fair.
God. I absolutely hate social media. So I think you're fantastic, Rob. And to be honest, you're always popping up all over my feed. And every time I see it, I'm like, that is great. I'm so happy that he is doing this because I certainly am not. But it's like Barry says, it's great if you're into it. I think 5 to 6 videos a day. Oh my God. Like I just have to applaud you on that one. I would not have the patience.
Well, it's definitely decreased in the amount as there's been a shift from quantity to quality. But I was, grasping at straws. How do I get people to talk about problem gambling and be interested in it at scale? Really not easy, and it's actually led to a couple challenges. But they're a little niche. So I don't know if you want to dive into them here, but it's like, how do you get people to care about a topic that's like naturally very unsexy to talk about online?
Yeah, it is tricky. I mean, just talking to, we'd often have students doing research pieces who contact us and, they want to talk to you for an hour and a half, an hour as part of their research. And yeah, it's that thing of, you mentioned, I think FanDuel are owned by an Irish company, Flutter.
Mm.
You'll see lots of Paddy Power shops when you're in Ireland. That's the same company. Uh, but like the likes of FanDuel, DraftKings, all these companies all around the world, Paddy Power over here in William Hill, and Sporting Bet in Australia, and all these companies just spend astronomical amounts of money, getting the coolest, funniest, sexiest celebrities on, sports stars, everybody to promote their product, not making it look as cool and fun and sexy and harmless as humanly possible, right?
Yeah.
And then you have usually people with no money, right, kind of go, this isn't completely harmless, by the way, and no, no budget, no production budget, and governments around the world, you know, as we would say over here, would really need to pull their socks up and start doing something. I mean, I was
Yeah.
suggesting to this student today that for every 10 ads that are on the TV or on social media to promote gambling, maybe we could have one public health message to balance that out.
Yeah.
Nobody's
There's
talking about sorry, please.
I'm sorry. I was gonna say we're not recognizing it as a public health issue in the US. So you're also ahead on that one. In fact, I very much just heard a direct quote from someone who is a stakeholder in the US gambling industry that said it is not a public health issue. Direct quote. But it's in terms of the advertising, as you're mentioning, there's incredible advertising going out, tons of money being spent in, promoting it, but also in getting people in the ads that are recognizable. The big issue that I have with the advertising is it's unregulated and it's held to a different standard than any other ad in which it features a dangerous or addictive product or even a product where you can lose money. And so the example I always reference is like if you see a banking commercial or like a stock market commercial in the United States, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, will enforce and regulate on that ad. And it'll say something on the bottom to the extent of like, if you sign up for this product, if you buy this product, you might lose money. On the gambling one, it says, call us if you have a problem, loser. It's like, that's literally what it says. And it's like, it's just, it's going to be one of these things where in 10 years, there's going to be all these apology letters going out from all these giant companies and influencers saying, we didn't realize it was dangerous, but it was dangerous very obviously the entire time.
Yeah, and like
Tipping.
the US had the advantage in that all these other countries around the world legalized and liberalized sports betting and online gambling and casino gambling generations ago, right? Literally generations ago. Ireland, the
Yep.
UK, Australia, got all these test cases. They're all English speaking countries. It's not like you have to go to some, get your Google Translate out. Like these are all English speaking countries, similar, not identical cultures, but similar cultures.
Yep.
And the gambling products are almost identical. And there's tons and tons of research from all these countries to show how harmful this stuff can be. And instead of the various US states, I know it's a federal system, so it makes it more complicated. Instead of the various US states going, okay, before we legalize this stuff and before we can open the floodgates here, we could take the opportunity to learn from Australia, from the UK, from Ireland, from all these different places, and set it up correctly so that we don't make the same mistakes that all these other places
Right.
made. But it seems like literally nobody at the top did that.
No, we think we're different. We want to be different so bad. It's why I can't tell you how far a kilometer is. I have no idea. We have our own system for that. We have our own system for everything because we think we're the top of the world. That's what it is. Oh, our gambling will be different. The American people are different than the Irish people, the Australian people. We don't have the same public health system, so it's different. There's so many excuses that can get pulled out, but we're seeing an increasing rate of people getting hooked to it. And we know that within the realm of people that get addicted to gambling, 20% will attempt to take their own life. I think that we're just going to reach a tipping point where enough people die before change is actually pushed in the upper levels of our government, which is terrible.
Rob, you obviously went with ODAT for your name, which is one day at a time. Just with regards to recovery and what has worked for you, and you mentioned a few things there. Was it the 12 steps? Do you find that that is what works for you? That that's your everyday recovery?
I worked through the 12 steps really intensely towards the beginning of my recovery, but specifically before I had my relapse. I was taking notes on it. I was working through prompts every day. I was making that what I wanted to make my meaning, right? I wanted to find what I cared about, and I thought maybe I can find it through this. And it felt good for a time being, but it felt like it felt like work to me almost, if that makes any sense to anyone out there. They were powerful steps, and what I really got from the GA community was the community itself. It was going to the meetings and chatting with people and understanding their triggers, understanding how they dealt with them. I enjoyed working through the 12 steps, and I'm sure that many people out there would say I should still be working through them every single day and getting through and keeping taking those notes, keeping doing those prompts. I've always felt like there was power to it. But what I really focused in on and what made the difference for me was just trying to be there for other people when they were there for me in the same way. So I did the steps to answer your question. I've worked through them, but I never felt the emotional connection to them that I felt in the room itself.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, I always say this, okay, GA didn't work for me, but like you, there's a lot I take from it. One day at a time, I'll say that to myself. I like the Serenity Prayer. I like a lot of the wording that is in it, but I just personally didn't connect to it at the time. But I think that, other things worked for me along the way. And it's just about finding from all different places what works and then putting it all together.
100%. I couldn't agree more. We can also go a little over. I can text Yusuf. It's okay if you have more questions.
Yeah, no, I don't want to. I promised at the start we wouldn't crash into your next meeting. I know we did say before we come on air that we're discussing this thing of your financial losses and whether it's right or wrong to focus
Yeah.
on the amounts of money. You had something you wanted to tell us about that from your own perspective.
Yeah, so a lot of times, and even someone that's listening to this might be able to relate to this. People will ask me how much money I lost, and depending on who's asking, I can kind of guess the reason as to why they're asking. Oftentimes, what it is someone asking me that question of what was your biggest loss or how much did you lose? Because they want me to say a number that's larger than theirs. Because if I say that, then it gives them context to keep going. So if I say I lost this amount of money and someone lost half that amount of money, and I say that I have a gambling addiction, that person will say, that's a gambling addict. I'm okay. I'm only half as bad. So I haven't reached that point yet. I can keep going till I get to that point. So what I like to say is that I went into debt 6 times over 6 years to the point where I had to work a second job to pay it off. Because if I say the amount, all it does is give people something to compare to and likely only causes problems. Either I lost more than them and they can keep going, or I didn't lose enough and I need to lose twice as much before I'm able to speak on the issue. But for anyone that's lost all their money, zero is the same, whether you had 1 million to start or whether you had 100 to start. If you have nothing left, it's the same feeling at the end of the day of desperation, trying to figure everything out. And that's why I like to use that kind of context rather than answering with a number to illustrate it. But yeah, it's usually either people who want to hear a big number or the news who kind of want a nice title on the video, which I understand completely as a content creator.
He lost $5 million and blah blah blah. Yeah, it's they do
But
like big they do like big numbers, all right. Yeah. Well, that's a great point to finish on, and thank you so much for coming on today. And you're I really hope you enjoy your trip to Dublin, and hopefully you'll make it outside of Dublin to other parts of Ireland as well when you and your family are over here. I know that the website is o-gamblingawareness.com, so that's ODAAT because it's one day at a time. Do you want to just shout out all your different tags on your social media platforms so people can check
sure.
you out and follow you?
Yeah. Sorry, it's a mouthful. I've been shifting through titles and names of the page to try to find the one that best expresses what I'm trying to express. This monstrosity of a name, ODAC Gambling Awareness, is what we've settled on. So that is the exact handle that you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and then the website once again is odacgamblingawareness.com. But yes, it's just push it together. It's all, all one big word, one word vomit, ODAT Gambling Awareness. Hopefully, you join up the community and we can keep connecting.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Rob. And yes, we're bang on time. I'm getting you to that meeting on time. That's true.
Perfect.
And take care. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Of course.
Thanks,
Thanks for
Rob.
having me. Thanks,
Thank
Claire.
you. Bye.